In the glittering maze of European courts, where alliances were traded like coins and reputations lived or died by candlelit whispers, Carlota Joaquina of Spain entered history like a storm no one knew how to contain. Born a Bourbon princess with fire in her blood, she grew up believing she was destined to rule, to command, to bend kingdoms toward her will. But the world she stepped into had no place for a woman who refused to bow. Instead of a crown she could wield, she received a marriage she despised. Instead of loyalty, she met suspicion. Instead of admiration, she faced a nation that hated her the moment she arrived. And as the years unfolded, Carlota's life became a spiral of bitter solitude. Rumors, scandals, betrayals, and desperate attempts to seize the power she believed was rightfully hers. By the end, the queen who once sought 2 kingdoms possessed nothing. No allies, no affection, not even the dignity history grants to the defeated. She died in a palace that had long since stopped hearing her voice, remembered only by the cruel name her people had given her, the Shrew of Queluz. Carlota Joaquina was born in 1775 into the brilliant yet suffocating world of the Spanish Bourbons, a dynasty that wrapped its children in silk while binding them with expectations heavier than any crown. Madrid, her birthplace, was a city of grand palaces, endless ceremonies, and quiet rivalries whispered behind fans. And in the middle of that intricate political theater stood a little girl with fire in her eyes. Too sharp, too intense, too unyielding for the delicate role expected of a princess. Even as a child, Carlota's presence commanded attention. Servants later said they could hear her long before they saw her. A small voice sharper than a blade, a laugh that cracked through the silence of palace halls, footsteps that never hesitated. She argued with tutors, refused to bow her head, and stormed out of rooms whenever someone tried to correct her. Adults dismissed it as childish stubbornness. Courtiers whispered that she had inherited the darker side of Bourbon pride, the same temperament that had shaped monarchs and destroyed them. But no matter what people thought, one truth was already visible. Carlota was not born to be quiet. Her parents had very different hopes for her. King Charles IV expected a princess who would strengthen alliances, soothe political anxieties, and embody the soft diplomacy the Bourbon dynasty desperately needed. Instead, he found himself raising a daughter who questioned orders, challenged senior advisors, and reacted to insults with the ferocity of someone who believed the world owed her respect. Queen Maria Luisa, herself known for her temper and sharp opinions, recognized the dangerous spark in her daughter. She admired it, feared it, and sometimes even used it. For Maria Luisa, Carlota's fire was something to be directed, not extinguished. As the 1780s unfolded, Europe simmered with tension. Monarchies watched each other nervously, fearing revolutions, political shifts, and the gradual erosion of royal authority. In this atmosphere, every royal marriage became a chess piece. Children were not raised for themselves, but for the treaties they would become. And in that game, Carlota Joaquina was an asset, one the Spanish crown could not waste. When she was barely 10 years old, the decision was made. Carlota would marry João, Crown Prince of Portugal, sealing a fragile peace between 2 uneasy Iberian neighbors. To the court, it was a practical match, uniting bloodlines, preventing conflicts, and ensuring future heirs. To Carlota, it was a betrayal. She had imagined a future where she would grow into the grandeur of Madrid, where she would stand beside the Spanish throne she considered her birthright. Instead, she was told she would be shipped to Portugal, a country she knew only through stereotypes. less refined, less powerful, and certainly less worthy of a Bourbon princess. Her indignation was immediate and unapologetic. Witnesses wrote that Carlota burst into tears, shouted at her tutors, and refused to practice Portuguese court etiquette. The more she resisted, the more the adults around her insisted that duty came before desires. But Carlota, even at 10, sensed that duty was the word adults used whenever they wanted to take something from her. The farewell ceremony in Madrid was elaborate, but beneath the music and rituals was a little girl filled with a kind of rage that no one knew how to soothe. As she boarded the carriage that would take her toward Lisbon, she did not look back at the palace. Some said she kept her gaze fixed forward in defiance. Others believed she refused to give her family the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But Carlota herself would later confess to her ladies-in-waiting that at that moment, she felt something break inside her, something that would never fully mend. The journey to Portugal marked the first time Carlota realized that royalty often meant loneliness. She traveled surrounded by attendants, yet felt entirely alone, trapped between what she was born into and what she now had to become. She saw landscapes change, heard new accents, and watched the world grow unfamiliar. With every mile, Madrid seemed more like a dream she was waking from. Portugal waited ahead, like a sentence she could not escape. When she arrived, the reaction was not what she expected. Portuguese courtiers found her loud, wild, and difficult to manage. They expected a mild-mannered child who would become a quiet, obedient Portuguese princess. Instead, they were confronted with a force of nature whose temper could silence a room and whose pride could cut through at any diplomatic nicety. Carlota interpreted their unease as disrespect. The court interpreted her behavior as arrogance. The fracture formed immediately. At 10 years old, Carlota Joaquina stepped into a palace that was foreign, colder, and far less receptive than the one she had left behind. The walls of Queluz did not echo with Spanish grandeur. The halls felt smaller, the rituals stricter, the expectations heavier. And though she was still a child, the Portuguese court judged her with the harshness of adults. Too loud, too stubborn, too Spanish. Thus began a lifelong war between Carlota Joaquina and Portugal. A war born not of politics, but of wounded pride. She had entered the marriage furious, and she would carry that fury like a torch, lighting every room she entered and burning every bridge she crossed. By the time she reached adolescence, the little girl with fire in her eyes had become a young woman convinced that the world had stolen something from her. And she was determined, with every breath, to take it back. Carlota Joaquina entered her marriage already wounded by resentment. But what awaited her in Portugal did not soothe her bitterness. It deepened it into something darker, more enduring, and more corrosive than anyone around her had expected. João, the crown prince she had been forced to marry, was gentle to a fault, soft-spoken, cautious, and profoundly uncomfortable with conflict. His temperament, shaped by a childhood spent under the shadow of his formidable mother, Queen Maria I, made him the emotional opposite of Carlota's explosive spirit. Where she advanced, he retreated. Where she argued, he avoided. Where she demanded, he quietly complied or disappeared behind the walls of his private chambers. They were a pairing designed by diplomacy, yet doomed by nature. The wedding itself was a spectacle of Iberian politics. Two courts celebrating a union neither bride nor groom desired. Once the ceremonies faded, their relationship quickly settled into a pattern that alarmed even seasoned courtiers. João had expected a young girl who would eventually adapt to Portuguese modesty and routine. Instead, he encountered a girl who challenged etiquette, questioned authority, and carried herself with a Spanish royal arrogance that grated on nearly everyone she met. Carlota, in turn, saw in João not a partner, but a tremor of weakness. Someone who lacked the fire, decisiveness, and dominance she believed a king should possess. To her, he was not merely a disappointing husband, but a symbol of everything she felt had been taken from her. It did not take long for the palace to fracture around their incompatibility. Within months, João and Carlota were living essentially separate lives. They slept in different rooms, ate in different salons, attended different events, and often communicated through intermediaries. João avoided confrontation, slipping away whenever Carlota's voice rose. Carlota interpreted his evasion as cowardice, and each retreat hardened her contempt. The Portuguese court, loyal to its prince, quietly sided with João, leaving Carlota in an environment where every misstep was noted, every outburst repeated, and every ambition viewed with suspicion. By her early teens, Carlota had already earned a reputation among courtiers for being volatile, demanding, and impossible to manage. Portuguese ladies-in-waiting, accustomed to restraint and decorum, struggled to control a princess who behaved as though the palace were a battlefield, and every social slight a declaration of war. Whenever João's advisors attempted to guide her into a more politically acceptable role, she lashed out, interpreting their advice as insult. She felt the court trying to diminish her, to confine her, to reduce her to a ceremonial ornament. Carlota had been raised to believe she would one day rule. Now she found herself treated as little more than a foreign guest, whose presence the palace tolerated rather than embraced. The deeper tragedy lay in how little either spouse could change their dynamic. João, though not unkind, could not bring himself to confront Carlota's frustrations or offer the affection she craved but would never admit needing. Carlota, for her part, could not forgive a marriage she had never chosen, a country she had never respected, and a husband she believed unworthy of the position she had been taught to revere. Their dysfunction did not erupt suddenly. It seeped slowly through the palace, poisoning their private lives and shaping the politics around them. As the years passed, their silent war became part of palace routine. Servants learned to predict when Carlota would slam her doors in anger. Ministers scheduled meetings to avoid encountering her. João grew ever more withdrawn, seeking refuge in religion, music, and the comfort of routine. Carlota grew more aggressive, her voice growing sharper, her demands louder, her temper more visible. Each day pushed them further apart, yet they remained bound by royal duty and the necessity of producing heirs. Children were born, 9 in total, but even these additions did not bring the couple closer. If anything, each pregnancy intensified the suspicion surrounding their marriage. Whispers circulated through court corridors. Did João truly father all these children? Was Carlota seeking affection elsewhere? João refused to engage in the rumors publicly, but his distance only fueled speculation. Carlota viewed the whispers as attacks on her dignity, yet her own behavior, her fierce independence, her refusal to appear at João's side, her private conversations with guards and courtiers, fed the rumors she despised. Their marriage was not simply unhappy. It was a union stripped of warmth, trust, and companionship. They did not fight publicly. João avoided conflict too thoroughly for that. And they did not reconcile privately. Instead, they coexisted like two wounded animals forced to share the same cage. Each nursing injuries the other refused to acknowledge. The loneliness inside their shared palace became another kind of exile for Carlota, one that felt more suffocating than her journey from Spain. At least then, she had been a child resisting an unwanted future. Now, she was a young woman trapped inside the consequences of that future. The Portuguese court observed all this with growing unease. A queen who could not control her temper, And a prince who could not control his household created an imbalance the ministers feared might erupt into political chaos. Rather than face her frustrations, they chose to contain them, reducing Carlota's influence, limiting her access to council meetings, and quietly encouraging João to maintain his emotional and physical distance. Each restriction confirmed Carlota's deepest belief, that Portugal intended to silence her forever. By the time she reached adulthood, the marriage, designed to strengthen two kingdoms, had produced only bitterness. Carlota no longer saw João as a husband or a king, but as an obstacle standing between her and the power she believed she deserved. João no longer saw Carlota as a partner, but as a force to be feared, avoided, and carefully managed. And the silent, stifling distance between them would shape every decision she made in the decades to come. As Carlota Joaquina settled into her role as Princess of Brazil and future Queen of Portugal, she soon discovered that the throne she had entered by marriage was not a seat of power, but a gilded prison whose doors would not open for her, no matter how loudly she demanded it. The Palace of Queluz was beautiful by architectural standards. Elegant ceilings, manicured gardens, and glittering receptions. But to Carlota, it felt like a carefully managed cage. A place where she was permitted to exist, yet never allowed to shape the world around her. And for a woman raised to believe that influence was her birthright, this denial cut deeper than any personal insult. In Spain, her sharp tongue had been tolerated as the vivid spark of a Bourbon princess. In Portugal, it was treated as a liability, something to suppress, monitor, and if possible, neutralize. She wanted to be involved in governance, but João's ministers, already wary of her foreign origins, made it clear in subtle, calculated ways that her participation was neither needed nor desired. Every council meeting closed its doors to her. Every decision was made without her. Every attempt to assert her opinion was met with polite dismissal or veiled irritation. The more she tried to enter the political sphere, the more barriers she encountered. Carlota attended court functions uninvited, interrupting discussions and challenging policies she deemed foolish or weak. She would rise from her seat, eyes blazing, launching into impassioned speeches that left nobles shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. But instead of earning respect, she earned avoidance. Ministers learned to rearrange meetings, to send information through intermediaries rather than face her wrath, to navigate around her presence like sailors steering away from a violent storm. What made her exclusion unbearable was that she understood exactly what was happening. She was not dismissed because she lacked intelligence. Carlota was well-educated, politically perceptive, and sharper than many of the men advising João. She was dismissed because she was a woman, a foreign one at that, and because the Portuguese court feared that granting her influence would give Spain a foothold in their internal affairs. Carlota interpreted their fears as insults, and their attempts to sideline her only fueled the fire she had carried since childhood. Inside her, anger began to take the place of hope. She felt herself tightening, hardening, becoming more rigid with each humiliation. She believed she had been robbed of power not because she lacked ability, but because the country she lived in refused to see her as anything more than a dangerous outsider. The palace that should have been her stage became, instead, a labyrinth of doors that slammed in her face. And with every rejection, she grew louder, angrier, more determined to force the world to hear her. It was in this suffocating environment that Carlota developed a new obsession. If power would not come to her through her husband, she would seize it on her own. Every insult fed her ambition. Every whisper strengthened her resolve. She read political papers that were not meant for her, pressured sympathetic nobles to support her, and challenged João in private arguments that left both of them exhausted and resentful. Joao, timid by nature, tried to avoid confrontation. But Carlota persisted, storming into his chambers, demanding explanations, questioning his decisions, and accusing him of weakness. Their marriage, already cold, became increasingly adversarial. A quiet war waged in palace corridors, marked not by shouting but by icy distance and cutting remarks. Meanwhile, rumors began to wrap themselves around her name like vines. Courtiers whispered about her temperament, her fury, her supposed lovers, her political ambitions. They claimed she was unpredictable, dangerous, unfit to be near the levers of state. These whispers hurt her deeply. But rather than retreat, she struck back. Her confrontations became more public. She interrupted ceremonies to correct officials. She openly mocked customs she found provincial. She scolded ladies-in-waiting for perceived disloyalty. The court responded by withdrawing even further, leaving Carlota isolated at the center of a world she refused to bend to her will. But isolation only strengthened her resolve. She began to see herself not as a foreign queen being excluded by a hostile court, but as a rightful political force fighting against incompetence and cowardice. She believed Portugal needed her. She believed she could save the monarchy from weak leadership. She believed she was destined for something larger than the role she had been forced into. Her frustrations spilled into every part of her life. Even the birth of her children, a source of joy for many royal women, did not soothe her. She loved them with a fierce devotion, but even they could not shield her from the growing sense that she was being erased from the political narrative of the kingdom. She watched Joao take on responsibilities she believed he could not handle, watched ministers maneuver around her influence, watched the country drift toward uncertainty while she, capable and eager, was kept at arm's length. By her 20s, Carlota Joaquina had become a queen in name but not in power. A woman surrounded by luxury, yet starved of influence. She moved through the palace like a restless ghost, seen but not welcomed, heard but not respected. And the more she was silenced, the more she sharpened herself for the battles she believed were still to come. Her life, once full of promise, had narrowed into a single, painful reality. She had neither the love she wanted nor the authority she believed she deserved. And in the vacuum left by both, her ambition began to twist into something dangerous. Rumors in a royal court are like smoke rising through a palace. Thin, silent, impossible to grasp, and yet powerful enough to choke a queen. For Carlota Joaquina, those whispers began as faint murmurs in the corners of Queluz, harmless enough to ignore. But as her temper grew sharper, as her political ambitions grew bolder, and as her marriage to Joao continued to deteriorate, the whispers found fuel. They spread through salons, kitchens, gardens, and council chambers until they no longer resembled the truth, but a twisted echo of everything the court feared she might be. Her reputation became the first battlefield she ever truly lost. The Portuguese nobles, already wary of her Bourbon arrogance, saw every act of defiance as confirmation of their worst expectations. Carlota raised her voice in council, proof of instability. She confronted a minister about a policy, evidence of danger. She walked unaccompanied in the garden speaking with guards, scandal. And because truth matters less than perception in the delicate machinery of power, the rumors did not need to be proven. They only needed to be repeated. Soon, those rumors turned intimate, invasive, and cruel. They took aim not at her politics, but at her honor. Whispers claimed that several of her 9 children were not fathered by Joao. The names changed depending on who told the story. Sometimes it was a handsome guard, sometimes a courtier, sometimes an unnamed nobleman whose identity could conveniently never be traced. In a court hungry for intrigue, Carlota's fierce temperament and independent habits became evidence. A queen who did not stand beside her husband must be unfaithful. A queen who challenged ministers must be unstable. A queen who loved power must be morally corrupt. No one stopped to consider that these accusations said more about Portugal's fear of a strong woman than about Carlota's behavior. The rumors intensified after the birth of her favorite son, Miguel. Miguel, who resembled her more than João. Miguel, whom she openly adored. Miguel, who possessed the spark and assertiveness she believed a future king needed. The court watched her affection and twisted it into something sordid. Ministers began muttering that her attachment to Miguel was too political, too strategic, and therefore suspicious. For Carlota, Miguel represented the influence she had been denied. For the nobles, he became the symbol of everything she might try to control. As Miguel grew, the rumors shifted from insinuation to accusation. Some whispered that João refused to confront her infidelity only because he feared her temper. Others claimed that the king had been humiliated, that his household was a nest of betrayal, that the queen had turned the royal lineage into a political farce. And because João's nature was timid, because he did not defend himself publicly, because he avoided conflict, the silence surrounding these rumors strengthened them even further. His quiet dignity became interpreted as weakness. His reluctance to challenge Carlota became interpreted as secret acknowledgement. The tragedy was not simply that the rumors existed, but that they became a defining part of her identity in Portugal, far more powerful than truth, law, or protocol. Carlota, who had long believed herself destined for greatness, found that her name was no longer synonymous with royal blood or political fire, but with scandal. She became a caricature in the eyes of the court, the wild Spanish woman whose passions could not be controlled, the foreign queen whose loyalties were suspect, the ambitious wife whose hunger for influence made her dangerous. Court letters from the era, written by diplomats, nobles, and visiting foreigners, reflect this transformation in chilling clarity. They describe her as volatile, untrustworthy, intoxicated by power, and a threat to the stability of the monarchy. Some used metaphors darker still, calling her a wildfire, a serpent, a poison that seeped into the royal household. These were not descriptions of a queen. They were warnings, and Carlota knew it. The rage that consumed her had less to do with the accusations themselves, and more to do with what they represented. The complete denial of her legitimacy. It was not enough that she had been denied influence. Now she was being denied dignity. Her marriage had already become a public secret of cold duty and mutual avoidance. Now her motherhood became the target of cruelty she could neither forgive nor forget. In her private chambers, she raged against the injustices carved into her reputation. She shouted at ladies-in-waiting. She demanded investigations. She confronted courtiers with accusations of betrayal. But once a reputation is set aflame, trying to extinguish it only spreads the fire further. Her outbursts became new fuel for gossip. Her anger, justified as it may have been, became proof of the very instability her enemies claimed she possessed. And amidst this whirlwind of humiliation, her isolation deepened. She stopped attending certain ceremonies, avoided gatherings where she knew whispers would follow her, and relied increasingly on a small circle of attendants she believed she could trust. Yet even within this circle, loyalty was uncertain. Fear creates informants more easily than friendship creates allies. The palace corridors, which once echoed with her fiery footsteps and defiant voice, now felt colder. She moved through them like a shadow, feared not for her authority, but for her reputation. And the realization that her name had become a weapon used against her ignited a fury that would shape the next decade of her life. For a queen whose greatest fear was irrelevance, the most painful wound was not the rumor itself. It was the realization that Portugal had already rewritten her story, casting her not as a monarch, but as a cautionary tale. By the time Carlota Joaquina entered her late 20s, the bitterness that had once simmered quietly in her heart had solidified into something sharper, an ambition no longer content to remain confined behind the locked doors of Queluz. She began to see the political landscape around her, not as a foreign kingdom she was forced to endure, but as a chessboard of opportunities waiting for someone bold enough to rearrange the pieces. And since the court refused to give her influence, she convinced herself she would take it. The more the ministers excluded her, the more determined she became to prove that the monarchy needed a strong, assertive hand. Her hand. The more João withdrew into his quiet rituals and predictable routines, the more she grew convinced that he was unfit to rule alone. In the growing vacuum between a timid prince and a defiant queen, Carlota imagined herself as the only figure capable of steering Portugal through the turbulence of Europe, where Napoleon's shadow darkened every border and monarchies trembled under the threat of collapse. She began quietly, almost cautiously at first. A word slipped to a noble here, a suggestion murmured to a foreign diplomat there, a private letter sent to Madrid expressing her disapproval of Portuguese governance. But each attempt to influence policy was met with resistance or indifference. Ministers ignored her, João avoided her, Spain offered no support, and the sensation of being dismissed, treated as irrelevant in her own palace, was a humiliation she could not tolerate. So, Carlota escalated. She started attending governmental councils uninvited, demanding that her voice be heard. When she was refused entry, she pressed sympathetic nobles to leak information. When João excluded her from state discussions, she stormed into his chambers with accusations that echoed through the palace walls. She insisted that she had the political intelligence he lacked, that Portugal would be safer in her hands, that a Bourbon princess was better suited to confront European chaos than a prince who could barely confront his own wife. Her desperation for authority soon bled into schemes. She pressured João to name her co-regent, arguing that a shared rule would strengthen the monarchy. But to João, who had spent his entire life being overshadowed by strong personalities, first his mother, then his advisors, and now his wife, Carlota's forcefulness felt like an attempt to seize power rather than share it. Instead of granting her what she wanted, he pulled away further, surrounding himself with advisors who reinforced his instinct to keep her at a distance. In Carlota's eyes, this was treason. Not against her, but against the dignity of the crown itself. How could a kingdom survive with a ruler so fearful of conflict, so easily manipulated by courtiers, so unwilling to take decisive action? She convinced herself that her ambition was not selfish, but necessary. And once a person imagines their hunger for power as a moral duty, there are very few lines they will not cross. It was around this time that Carlota began cultivating her own inner circle. Nobles, officers, foreign diplomats, anyone who would listen to her grievances and entertain her ideas. They met in discreet salons, behind heavy wooden doors, often under the pretense of discussing cultural affairs or family matters. But everyone present knew these gatherings were political seeds planted in secrecy. She spoke of Portugal's vulnerability, João's indecisiveness, the incompetence of ministers, and the need for stronger, more assertive leadership. Some listeners nodded out of genuine agreement. Others nodded out of fear or fascination. And a few nodded because aligning themselves with a fiery queen felt like its own kind of thrill. Her boldness grew as Napoleon's armies swept across Europe. When Portugal's monarchy fled to Brazil in 1807, a desperate move to escape French invasion, Carlota saw not danger, but an opening. The court's exile across the Atlantic created chaos, blurred lines of authority, and left vast territories in the Americas vulnerable. While João tried to maintain stability from Rio de Janeiro, Carlota saw an extraordinary opportunity. She could assert authority over the Spanish colonies in South America, claiming them as her own sphere of influence. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A stage larger than Portugal, a territory rich with potential, a chance to become something more than a sidelined queen. She sent letters to political leaders in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, presenting herself as a legitimate Bourbon alternative to the destabilized Spanish crown. She issued proclamations asserting her claim to the Rio de la Plata region, portraying herself as a protector of Spanish-American rights at a time when the old European order was collapsing. For a brief, trembling moment, diplomats took her seriously. The idea of a Bourbon princess seizing authority in South America was both plausible and terrifying. Her name was whispered in political circles far beyond Lisbon and Madrid. She could almost feel a crown forming in her hands, a crown of her own, not one borrowed through marriage. But the dream cracked as quickly as it had formed. Local leaders in South America distrusted her motives, seeing her not as a liberator, but as another monarch seeking to impose foreign rule. Portuguese ministers in Rio panicked at the idea of the queen gaining independent power. João's advisors tightened their control, restricting her movements and monitoring her communications. And Spain, far from supporting her vision, saw her actions as treason against its own collapsing empire. By 1810, her plans were in ruins. Every scheme she touched collapsed under political suspicion, diplomatic backlash, or João's intervention. Instead of gaining influence, she earned more distrust. The court's fear of her hardened, her isolation deepened, and the humiliation of repeated failure carved itself into her heart like a scar she carried for the rest of her life. In the end, Carlota's ambition, which might have flourished in another era, under another marriage, in another country, became the weapon that Portugal used against her. Her hunger for power, once a spark, had grown into the wildfire the court always feared. And though she never succeeded in seizing a crown of her own, the damage she inflicted on her reputation and the fear she ignited in those around her would shape the rest of her tragic decline. By the early years of the 19th century, the Portuguese people had already made up their minds about Carlota Joaquina. And once a society decides who a woman is, especially a queen who refuses to obey the mold carved for her, the verdict is almost impossible to overturn. No decree, no speech, no act of charity could erase the whispers that had wrapped themselves around her name like thorns. Portugal did not see a complex woman shaped by disappointment. She became, in their imagination, a creature of temper, fury, and unrestrained ambition. And from that imagination emerged the nickname that would cling to her for generations: a Shrew de Queluz, the Shrew of Queluz. The name did not appear in a single moment of outrage, but seeped gradually into the cultural bloodstream of the kingdom. It spread the way mold grows in damp corners, quietly, invisibly, until suddenly it coated everything. At first it was spoken in hushed conversations among courtiers, a way to mock her behind the safety of closed doors. Then it moved to the servants' quarters, where gossip traveled faster than any royal carriage. From there, it escaped into the streets of Lisbon, whispered by fishwives and echoed in taverns, until finally it became a national joke, a shorthand for everything the Portuguese disliked about their foreign queen. And Carlota knew. She always knew. She heard the nickname first through the cruel politeness of court ladies who attempted to soften their laughter by covering their mouths with lace gloves. She heard it again through ministers who pretended not to hear their own servants mocking her behind tapestries. Worst of all, she heard it from foreign diplomats who repeated it with the same mixture of amusement and caution reserved for volcanic eruptions, entertaining from afar, terrifying up close. The name was not simply an insult. It was a death sentence for her legitimacy. In a monarchy, reputation is currency. A queen whose name inspires fear can still rule. But a queen whose name inspires laughter is already dethroned in the hearts of her people. And for Carlota, whose every ambition depended on being taken seriously, the nickname was not merely humiliating, it was annihilating. She tried to reclaim dignity by asserting even more dominance in the palace. She raised her voice during receptions, corrected nobles publicly, and challenged officials in full view of the court. Yet each attempt to assert strength was twisted into confirmation of her alleged madness. Her temper, once a weapon she wielded with purpose, became the very rope the court used to bind her. The harder she fought, the deeper she sank into the caricature others created. It was a vicious, unending cycle. The more she was mocked, the more furious she became. The more furious she became, the more she was mocked. Even João, her husband, contributed to the erosion of her image, though not intentionally. His gentle, hesitant nature contrasted sharply with her volcanic temperament. Where João was patient and slow, Carlota was sharp and impulsive. When he walked through the palace with quiet dignity, she stormed across it like a tempest. The people saw this contrast not as two flawed individuals trapped in an unhappy marriage, but as proof that she was the problem and João the victim. In the cultural imagination of Portugal, she became the turbulent foreign wife tormenting a good-hearted prince. Reality was far more complicated, but reality rarely matters when a narrative is easier to believe. As the nickname spread, Carlota's world shrank. Fewer ladies dared approach her. Ministers shortened conversations with her to avoid provoking her temper. Servants bowed more quickly and fled more swiftly. Even the palace corridors felt tighter, as though the walls themselves were pulling away. Her isolation, already painful, became suffocating. The Palace of Queluz, once a symbol of royal splendor, transformed into a cage of polished stone where her enemies did not need keys to lock her inside. Public opinion did the job for them. In private moments, Carlota raged against the name with a fury that frightened even her most loyal attendants. She smashed porcelain, tore letters, and paced her chambers with clenched fists, speaking aloud to herself about conspiracies she believed were forming around her. Whether or not those conspiracies truly existed mattered less than the fact that she felt hunted by the very people she was meant to rule. Every whisper outside her door sounded like mockery. Every quiet step in the hallway felt like an insult. Every lowered gaze seemed to say, "We see what you've become." There were nights when she sat alone in her chambers, staring into the mirror, asking no one in particular how her life, once full of promise, had transformed into a tragedy of ridicule. The girl who had left Madrid furious but proud had become a queen who could not stand to hear her own name spoken. And yet, beneath the rage, there was a wound far deeper than anger. A wound born of humiliation, betrayal, and the terror of being forgotten. Carlota wanted to matter. She wanted her presence to shape history, to command respect, to be remembered as a queen of substance. Instead, her legacy was collapsing into a nickname designed to erase her entirely. The Shrew of Queluz. It was meant to diminish her, but in some dark, tragic way, it also defined her, not as she truly was, but as history chose to remember her. When the Portuguese court fled to Brazil in 1807, escaping Napoleon's approaching armies, most members of the royal family saw the journey as a humiliating exile. A desperate attempt to preserve the monarchy while abandoning the very soil it was meant to protect. But Carlota Joaquina did not see exile. She saw possibility. The Atlantic crossing, with its tempestuous waves and uncertain winds, felt less like a retreat and more like a passage into a new world where old rules might finally loosen their grip on her fate. Portugal had confined her, silenced her, mocked her. But Brazil, vast, unstable, politically fragmented, seemed like a canvas large enough for her ambitions, at last. The moment she stepped onto Brazilian soil, the humid air clinging to her gown and the overwhelming soundscape of a land bursting with life, Carlota sensed opportunity. Rio de Janeiro was nothing like Lisbon. It was louder, more chaotic, full of tensions between colonists, slaves, nobles, priests, merchants, and foreign agents, all competing for influence in a colony suddenly transformed into the capital of an empire. Power was scattered, uncertain, in flux. Precisely the environment where someone bold, charismatic, and relentless could carve out a space for herself. Carlota believed, with unwavering conviction, that Brazil was her stage, and she intended to perform. The political context seemed almost designed for her. Spain, her homeland, had fallen into crisis under Napoleon's invasion. The Spanish king, her father, had been forced to abdicate. Chaos rippled across the Spanish colonies in the Americas, particularly the Rio de la Plata region, where leaders debated independence, allegiance, and the possibility of finding a new sovereign figure to stabilize the region. To Carlota, this was not merely international upheaval. It was a door, and she moved toward it with the steady purpose of someone who had spent her life waiting for a moment exactly like this. She believed she, a Bourbon princess living in Rio, could become the rightful protector or even ruler of the Spanish-American territories. After all, she reasoned, she was a direct descendant of Spanish royalty, untouched by Napoleon, geographically positioned in the New World, and backed by the prestige of the Portuguese crown. In a world collapsing under French pressure, she imagined herself as a phoenix rising from the ashes of two empires. Her first moves were cautious but decisive. She reached out to leaders in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and other Spanish colonies through letters written in her own hand, filled with passionate declarations of loyalty to the Bourbon line and warnings about the danger of French-imposed rule. She argued that the Spanish Americas needed a legitimate Bourbon figure, someone strong, competent, and resistant to Napoleon. Many of her letters ended with the same quiet implication: and who better than me? For a fleeting moment, the idea gained traction. Some South American leaders, desperate for stability, entertained her proposal. British diplomats in the region considered her claim a useful temporary tool. Even certain factions in Portugal watched her with cautious interest, wondering if her success might strengthen the broader influence of the Portuguese monarchy. But Carlota was not dealing with a static kingdom of courtiers. She was dealing with revolutionaries, opportunists, generals, smugglers, priests, and visionaries, fighting to determine the future of an entire continent. And they had no intention of exchanging the distant authority of Madrid for an equally distant queen sitting in Rio de Janeiro. Suspicion grew quickly. Some believed Carlota wanted to impose a new monarchy upon them. Others feared she would be a puppet for Portuguese expansion. Still others simply distrusted any European claim to leadership in a region already bubbling with ideas of independence. As her letters circulated, they became objects of both intrigue and alarm. The political elites of the Rio de la Plata began to step back cautiously, unsure of how far they could trust the ambitious queen across the ocean. The Portuguese ministers around João, terrified of Carlota gaining independent influence, responded with swift paranoia. They perceived her ambitions as a direct threat to the fragile order of the exiled court. João's advisors, who already saw her as unpredictable, lobbied him to restrict her communications, limit her movement, and keep her under quiet surveillance. Carlota's private meetings were monitored. Her letters were intercepted. Her influence, instead of expanding as she had envisioned, was constricted tighter than ever before. In the end, her political campaign in South America died the way many of her endeavors had died in Portugal. Stifled by suspicion, undermined by rivals, and crushed by her inability to win genuine support. The temporary hope she had tasted evaporated, leaving behind the sour bitterness of yet another defeat. But Brazil did not merely fail her, it turned on her. The court in Rio began to see her less as an ambitious royal and more as a destabilizing force. Diplomats warned João VI that Carlota could ignite international conflict. Ministers quietly whispered that she might attempt a coup. Guards were reassigned. Doors were locked. Corridors that once echoed with her fiery footsteps now seemed to close around her. For a woman who had imagined Brazil as a stage for reinvention, the realization that she was more trapped than ever before was a cruelty she had not anticipated. She had crossed an ocean seeking power, but had arrived only to find a larger, more complex prison. Her Brazilian years, once full of potential, became a long stretch of disillusionment. And with each failed scheme, each intercepted letter, each whispered warning, Carlota Joaquina felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. Brazil had been her final chance, and like every chance before it, it slipped through her fingers, leaving her angrier, more isolated, and more desperate than she had ever been. For most queens, the court might turn hostile. Ministers might grow suspicious, and the public might whisper cruel names. But the family, at least in theory, remains a final refuge, a place where blood offers a kind of fragile protection against the world outside. But Carlota Joaquina, long trapped between her own ambition and Portugal's fear of her, discovered that even this final refuge could crumble. In Brazil, far from the palaces of Lisbon, far from Madrid's familiar intrigues, she began to lose the only things that could have softened the bitterness inside her. Her children, one by one, slipping beyond her reach. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, with the quiet distancing of her daughters. They had grown up watching their mother's storms. Her anger at court officials, her arguments with João, her fierce proclamations about power and betrayal. In their childhoods, these scenes were simply part of palace life, the background noise of royal upbringing. But as they matured, they began to see what the rest of the court saw. A woman at war, not only with her enemies, but with her own isolation, her own fears, her own reputation. The daughters, taught by their tutors to be gentle, composed, and politically cautious, learned to walk on eggshells around her. Carlota interpreted their hesitation as disloyalty. They, in turn, interpreted her volatility as danger. None of this was spoken aloud. The separation was quiet, slow, inevitable. Her daughter Maria Teresa, always sensitive to the atmosphere of the court, avoided long conversations with her, fearful of triggering one of Carlota's tempests. Maria Francisca, whose marriage prospects required careful public image, understood that too close an association with her mother could complicate everything. Even the younger daughters, who might have clung to her in innocence, were guided away gently by governesses instructed to maintain stability. Stability, of course, meant distance from their mother. Carlota watched them drift with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. Rage, because she believed the court was poisoning her children against her. Heartbreak, because deep down she knew she had contributed to the fear surrounding her name. But she would rather fracture further than admit this aloud. Pride had been her armor since childhood, and she clung to it even as it cut her from the inside. But the greatest wound came from her sons, not the distant ones who had inherited Joao's gentle temperament, but the one child she believed destiny had carved specifically for her, Miguel. Miguel was her favorite, her creation, her last hope. In him, she saw the spark that Joao lacked, a boldness she recognized as her own. The court whispered that her affection bordered on political obsession, and they were right. Carlota was not blind to Miguel's flaws. She simply believed that a strong will, even an unruly one, was necessary in a world threatened by revolutions, conspiracies, and shifting empires. She wanted Miguel to become what she had never been allowed to be: powerful, decisive, feared. And Miguel listened. He absorbed her grievances, her warnings, her belief that Portugal needed a ruler with an iron spine. He learned to distrust the ministers who sidelined his mother and to resent the father who remained passive in the face of political storms. Carlota sculpted him not through gentle guidance, but through fierce conviction, molding him into the weapon she intended to wield against the forces that had humiliated her for years. But ambition passed from mother to son can be unpredictable. Miguel, emboldened by Carlota's fire, attempted his own coup, an uprising that shook the already fragile stability of the exiled court. Whether Carlota directly encouraged it remains debated by historians, but the court had already decided the narrative before the dust settled. Miguel did not act alone. The queen was behind it. The accusation was as swift as it was brutal. Joao, terrified and pressured by advisors, exiled Miguel. The court blamed Carlota openly for the chaos. Ministers called her a threat to national security. Foreign diplomats whispered that she had finally gone too far. And the Portuguese people, who had already branded her the Shrew of Queluz, pointed to Miguel's rebellion as proof that she was poisoning the royal lineage with her ambition. But the worst blow was not political. It was personal. Miguel, the son she had trusted, the only child she believed truly understood her, was sent away. And though she wanted to rage, to curse, to fight, Carlota found herself suddenly muted. The court watched her closely. Her letters were monitored, her movements restricted. Her influence, already fragile, collapsed completely. For the first time in her life, Carlota was not merely isolated by politics, but abandoned by the very people she had created. Her daughters approached her with wary courtesy. Her sons distanced themselves for their own survival. Joao kept her under discreet surveillance, offering neither comfort nor confrontation. Even courtiers who once listened to her with feigned respect now avoided her entirely. And in that cold, echoing palace in Rio, Carlota Joaquina finally confronted a loneliness unlike any she had ever known. Not the loneliness of a foreign queen, not the loneliness of political exile, but the loneliness of a mother whose children had quietly chosen to live in a world where she no longer existed. Her fury had once made her terrifying. Now her isolation made her irrelevant. And for a woman who had spent her entire life fighting irrelevance, this was the cruelest punishment of all. When Joao VI died in 1826, The palace fell into a hush thick as winter fog. Yet for Carlota Joaquina, the silence was different. It was not mourning. It was the moment the last barrier between her and the full judgment of the Portuguese court slipped away. João, in life, had never loved her, never defended her, never truly stood beside her. But he had tolerated her, and tolerance, however faint, had protected her from complete exile. With him gone, Carlota was no longer the queen consort of a reigning monarch. She was a relic of a painful past, a living reminder of political turmoil, ambition, and scandal. And the court wasted no time in locking every remaining door in her face. Within days, ministers began reorganizing the palace, closing corridors she once strode through as if they belonged to her, and reassigning the servants she trusted to positions far from her chambers. She was barred from state councils, excluded from ceremonies, and treated not as a dowager queen, but as a potential threat, an unpredictable force that needed to be contained before it could rise again. They did not even hide their intentions. Some gestures were subtle, but many were deliberate, almost cruelly meticulous. Letters withheld, visits discouraged, attendants warned not to pass along political rumors that might agitate her. The message was unmistakable. Her influence had ended. For the first time in her life, Carlota Joaquina confronted a world in which she had no leverage left. The palace that had once trembled under her temper now learned to breathe easier without her presence. Ministers who once feared her outbursts now spoke freely within earshot of her chambers, confident she could do nothing to intervene. Even her children, grown, distant, shaped by years of conflict, did little to soften the blow. Pedro, now Emperor of Brazil and briefly King of Portugal, kept her at arm's length, careful not to entangle himself in the shadow of her reputation. The daughters who remained near her visited out of duty, their stiff embraces full of a sorrow they could not express and a caution they could not shed. Only a small handful of attendants remained loyal, tending to her needs not out of political loyalty, but out of human pity. And pity, for Carlota Joaquina, was salt in the wound. She wandered the halls of the palace like a displaced spirit, her footsteps slow, her once fiery eyes dulled, but still searching for an audience that no longer existed. The marble floors that had echoed with her arguments now echoed with silence. The mirrored salons reflected a woman who looked less like a queen and more like a warning. Thin, severe, restless, wrapped in shawls even in the Brazilian heat, muttering about betrayals she believed were still unfolding around her. In her mind, the world had not changed. The conspiracies were still alive. The ministers were still plotting. The crown was still vulnerable. She had simply been kept from the battlefield. But the truth was far harsher. There was no battlefield left. The political storms of her life had passed her by. The world she had fought to control, Europe, the colonies, the Portuguese throne, her children, had moved on without her. New monarchs, new ministers, new crises filled the void she once tried to dominate. Carlota, who had once raged at being excluded, now found herself excluded without anyone bothering to rage back. Her health deteriorated slowly, worn down by years of emotional strain, political frustration, and the quiet despair of isolation. She stopped attending meals and took to eating alone in her chamber. She paced at night, unable to sleep, whispering to attendants about letters she was sure were being hidden from her, about alliances she could still form, about ministers who feared her return. Some nights, she demanded ink and paper, attempting to write political directives no one would ever read. Other nights, she sat in a chair by the window, staring into the gardens, speaking softly about Madrid. her childhood, her lost homeland, the life she might have lived had she never been forced into a marriage she despised. In these final years, she drifted between sharp lucidity and fevered paranoia. She believed her enemies were closing in, though in truth, they had long since declared victory over her. She spoke of crowns she still intended to claim, though no crown remained within her reach. She insisted to her attendants that history would vindicate her, though she feared, more than she would ever admit, that history had already written her epitaph. Death came quietly in January 1830, not with the unrestrained fury that had marked her life, but with a whisper of exhaustion. She died in her palace chambers, surrounded not by grieving children, not by devoted courtiers, but by silence, the one companion she had never learned to master. There was no grand funeral procession. No throngs of mourners filled the streets. No speeches honored her resilience or her intellect or even her tragedy. The Portuguese court, eager to close the chapter she represented, gave her a burial befitting a queen in name, but not a queen in memory. Even in death, Carlota Joaquina remained what she had been in life, a presence people preferred to look away from. She had fought kingdoms, courts, ministers, and even her own family. But in the end, the only thing she could not conquer was the indifference of the world. History remembers Carlota Joaquina with a coldness that few queens receive. A coldness sharpened not only by her own defiance, but by the world that refused to make room for her. She lived in an age when royal women were expected to be silent ornaments, gentle, obedient, politically invisible. And Carlota violated every rule. She spoke too loudly, wanted too fiercely, pushed too far. And in return, the world pushed back with equal force, shaping her legacy into a caricature that hid the far more complicated woman underneath. Yes, she was ambitious, restlessly, relentlessly ambitious. But ambition in a queen was considered dangerous, while ambition in a king was celebrated as vision. Yes, she was volatile, sharp-tongued, impulsive, difficult. But much of that volatility was born from a lifetime spent being denied every avenue of influence. And yes, she made enemies. Too many, too quickly. But many of those enemies had already decided her fate long before she ever lifted her voice. Her tragedy was never that she was monstrous. Her tragedy was that she was unheard. She fought to matter in a world designed to silence her. She reached for power in a marriage built to restrain her. She demanded respect in a court that mocked her. And in the end, she died without love, without influence, and without redemption, reduced to a nickname that stripped her of dignity, the Shrew of Queluz. But when we look past the rumors, past the scandals, past the jagged edges of her reputation, we find a woman out of place in her own era, a woman who burned too brightly in a world too small for her fire. And perhaps her greatest legacy is not her failures, but the painful reminder that strong women in fragile systems are often remembered not for their humanity, but for their defiance. Carlota Joaquina wanted a crown, a voice, and a destiny that matched the fire she carried since childhood. What she received was silence. And that silence, heavy, merciless, unforgiving, is the true tragedy of her life.